the U.S. expanding its critical mineral strategy into a broader trade bloc, partnering with the EU, Japan, and Mexico to strengthen supply chains that are vital to economic and national security. That's all coming up while reducing the U.S.'s reliance on China. This plan includes new memorandums and actions to boost mining, processing, recycling, and stockpiling, while exploring preferential trade frameworks, including price floors with allied nations. Joining me now to walk us through it is the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. Jamieson, it's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for being here this morning.
It's great to be here. How are you?
Good. Can you walk us through how this is going to work? I'd like to understand better these price floors and really what this means for trade and the supply of these very important minerals for our security in the U.S., how it may reshape the global minerals landscape. Jamieson.
Well, Maria, the Trump administration is taking a whole-of-government approach. My office, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, we're working in tandem with the Commerce Department, the Energy Department, the War Department, the State Department, the National Security Council, and others to align other countries with our policy of diversifying our critical mineral supply, which includes rare earths. So over the past 6 months, all these agencies have worked together with many partner countries to sign memorandums of understanding about having access to minerals in each other's countries, about working together to invest in processing and downstream manufacturing. And now we're starting to negotiate an agreement on trading critical minerals, which will talk about things like establishing price floors on a mineral-specific basis, phasing these in as appropriate, agreeing to investment rules about ensuring mutual access, talking about how to have offtake agreements and financing and public-private partnerships. Again, it's a whole-of-government approach and has to touch on each of these elements to make it economic to make and produce critical minerals in the U.S. and its trading partners.
I mean, it's so important given the fact that China has dominated this area, and we need these minerals in so many industries, most importantly, the military, right?
Exactly right. These critical minerals, they certainly go into things like our automobiles or our cell phones, but they go into our defense and weapon systems, satellites, missiles, etc. And so they're of critical national security importance. It's interesting because a lot of them are just, they're commodities, they're minerals you pull out of the ground. Even the downstream applications like rare earth magnets, these were technologies pioneered in the United States in the 60s. So these aren't even new technologies, but they are key capabilities. And we have a lot of these critical minerals right here in the United States. And so we're working to identify these, explore them, and accelerate environmental approvals and all other kinds of things to make sure that we can get these things out of the ground and get them processed and manufactured right here on U.S. soil.
Yeah, I mean, how did we get here, Jamieson? Because I know that, you know, Beijing has long been the producer of products to the world, partly because it wasn't doing very much in terms of consumption. But the U.S. did have a lock on the refining of these minerals a long time ago. Is it that we just sold to China at that time?
That's exactly right. It was a stupid decision by policymakers and the business community at the time. As I mentioned, the United States pioneered this technology with respect to rare earths, for example. Working with the Japanese, we refined it. And then in the 90s, there was a company called MagnaQuench that ended up being sold to the Chinese. The U.S. government approved it, and after a few years of operations, they closed that operation down. They moved it to China. And China, as you know, they have plans. They have economic plans. They sketch it out 5, 10, 15 years. And for a long time, they wanted to secure control over the world's critical mineral supply chains, and they've advanced quite a bit in that goal.
So what are the most important minerals that we're talking about? I know graphite and gallium and tungsten are important, but that's sort of a dominant place that China has. Are there specific minerals that are more important than others then to those types of things like the military?
Well, the ones you mentioned are quite important. They're important for radiation-hardened semiconductors and things like that. Also neodymium. Neodymium is what goes into the permanent magnets that are used in electric motors. And anything that has an electric motor these days has a neodymium magnet. And so you have to have neodymium. And there are heavy rare earths, there are light rare earths. One piece of good news is that in Utah, we've discovered a deposit of heavy rare earths that's quite similar to the types of deposits they have in China. And so the U.S. government is working with that company to try to bring that that mine online and get processing done. So there's a lot of good news on this front. In South Carolina, we've already started rolling off permanent magnets, the first ones made in 25 years. So we're already advancing in this effort.
That's very interesting. We're going to talk coming up in the program with the CEO of U.S. Antimony, who has a lot of important minerals as well to tell us about. But what about, you know, the fact that China's way of doing things, they've got the state banks, they're running. I mean, do they have an upper hand just because, you know, it's top down as opposed to democracy here?
They do have a different economic model. They have a different governance model, and allows them to allocate capital from the government level. And while it's not efficient from an economic sense, we try to make a profit in the United States and throughout the West. In China, they have geopolitical goals with respect to their economy and their state-owned companies. This is part of the reason why we're trying to work together with other countries to set price floors for different minerals. That helps make it economic, because right now the demand for critical minerals is a demand that goes to products produced using non-market practices, things that are, things that are subsidized, and production that's subsidized. We want to make sure that our companies can get a return on their investment. It makes it economically viable to produce critical minerals here in the U.S. and in countries that also have market practices.
Yeah, well, which is why I understand the agenda in terms of taking stakes in some of these companies, like the government taking a stake in Mountain Pass, for example. But I asked your colleague, Secretary Scott Bessent, about China's role here when he joined me on Sunday, and here's what he had to say. Watch this.
The Chinese have lived up to their end of the bargain. They've completed their soybean purchases. It's my belief that President Trump is the only world leader who she respects, and that relationship between the two of them allows for the relationship to be respectful. But we're going to be great competitors with them. We don't want to disengage, but we do need to de-risk.
So what should we expect on this subject when the president meets with Xi Jinping? Is that meeting still on the calendar for April, Jamieson?
That's right. It's still scheduled. The president had a great call with President Xi last week. And as Secretary Bessent mentioned, we are competitors with the Chinese. We're always going to have some level of trade with the Chinese. We want to make sure that trade is in our interests, that it recognizes our national security concerns. But there are a lot of areas where we can buy from them. We should be selling to them. We just need to make sure that that's managed in a way that's good for our economy and for our national security.
So what are our allies saying about this? Because I know that one other way that China has been able to get a leg up in some regard is by tapping into and coordinating with other countries like Africa, countries in Africa, countries in Latin America as well. What is President Trump doing on that score?
Well, importantly, the world trading system that existed for the past 25 years, the net result of that system was that a lot of the manufacturing went to China, and China became the world's biggest supplier. Prior to that, the United States had been the world's biggest supplier. We had the most manufacturing. We had the most exports. President Trump is changing the global trade system in favor of the United States. Just over the past 10 days, we've signed agreements with Argentina, with Bangladesh, with India, before that with Guatemala and El Salvador. And all of these deals open these markets more to U.S. exports, and they also talk about cooperation in dealing with distortions in the global markets, whether it's subsidies coming from third countries or developing rules of origin to make sure that the goods that are traded between the United States and a given country are truly products of those two countries.
That is wonderful. I want to talk more about trade with you because the president is now threatening to block the opening of that new U.S.-Canada bridge. Canada wants a bridge from Ontario into the U.S., but the president says he's not going to allow this Gordie Howe International Bridge to open until Canada fully compensates the U.S. and agrees to new negotiations. What can you tell us about this new negotiation, this reset with Canada that the president is taking on?
Well, this negotiation is specific to the bridge. As you may know, there's an existing bridge up there, the Ambassador Bridge, that's operated by a U.S. company, and it has tolls and that kind of thing. The new bridge, the Gordie Howe Bridge, is Canadian-owned and operated. And there's a concern, a valid concern on the part of the president, that this bridge was allowed to be built. They didn't necessarily use American content in a bridge that's going into the United States. There's a question as to the proceeds of tolls, et cetera, and so there's going to be a negotiation on that front into how that bridge should be treated. If it's going to be going into the U.S., which is the main economy, right? We have a $29 trillion economy. The Canadian economy is, between $1 and $2 trillion. The United States needs to make sure that it has its fair share of any proceeds from that bridge and the economic activity that it generates.
Well, I mean, if it's going into Michigan, I mean, or coming into the U.S. from Ontario, are you saying that the Canadians are expecting that the U.S. gets no revenue from that?
I think that's the understanding. I haven't read all of the documents for the commercial operation of the bridge, but we've been hearing some concerns. And again, we have the existing Ambassador Bridge where the U.S. has more of a say. We just want to make sure, again, that our economic and national security is preserved, whether it's with Canada or China or Brazil or whoever it is. This is the president's policy. It's an America First policy, and we have to make sure that it's recognized. We implement this policy on every border, land border, air border, sea border.
So your plans and the president's plans have long been to do bilateral deals. But the president did USMCA, and that was the trade deal with Canada and Mexico. But you've taken a different tack this time around. You want to do bilateral, separate deals, one with Canada. Can you tell us about that reset trade deal that is expected, this summer?
So we have to review the USMCA. There's a joint review, and we baked this into the USMCA because for a long time, under NAFTA, there was no review scheduled. There was never any opportunity to take a look at the agreement and adjust it if necessary, which makes no sense. It makes no business sense. It makes no economic sense. So we're reviewing it. We're entering into negotiations with Mexico right now. Our economic relationship with Mexico is very different than our relationship with Canada. The labor profile down there is different. The export-import relationship is different. The types of goods are different. If there are areas where there's overlap where it makes sense to align on things like rules of origin or external tariff and trade policy, then we'll do that. But generally speaking, these negotiations are going to proceed bilaterally and separately. The Mexicans are being quite pragmatic right now. We've had a lot of discussions with them. With the Canadians, it's more challenging. They continue to have certain barriers. They refuse to sell U.S. wine and spirits on their shelves. There are a variety of issues that they have not addressed and they aren't addressing. And this makes it a big challenge and an obstacle for starting real negotiations with them.
So is it all about the president using tariffs as leverage here again, a higher tariff on Canada? I mean, I remember in Davos just a couple of weeks ago, the Canadian Prime Minister was, he was really pushing back on stage against President Trump in his speech.
The thing to keep in mind with Canada is this is a country that's 75% dependent on the United States for its gross domestic product. We're always going to have some kind of a trading relationship with Canada. We have to make sure that it's fair. We have to make sure that it's equal. It goes beyond economics. It goes to defense partnership, burden sharing with respect to NATO, the Golden Dome that the president's trying to establish. Just by pure geography, we're right next to Canada, and it means that we have to have a relationship that is effective for both of us.
Yeah.
It can't be a situation where the Canadians have an antagonistic relationship or where we can't, on a very pragmatic basis, figure out common interests and come to an understanding.
Great points all around. You've got an India summit coming up, the U.S. and India unveiling that interim trade framework where the U.S. cut tariffs on Indian goods to 18%, down from 25%, moving closer to a broader deal expected by March. What can you tell us about that? Is India really going to shift away from buying Russian oil and committing to buy up to $500 billion in U.S. energy and aircraft and technology over the next 5 years?
The short answer is yes. They've already started winding down their purchases of Russian energy products. They've started ramping back up purchases of American energy and energy from other sources. We've talked to them about oil from Venezuela. Remember, before 2022, the Indians did not really procure Russian oil. It's really an artifact of the Russia-Ukraine war and the discounted oil they could get. And remember, they'd get oil from Russia, they'd refine it, and they'd sell the gas to the Europeans, right? I mean, Europe and India essentially were underwriting Russia's war war in Ukraine. But India is really committed. They've already started expanding some of their commitments with respect to purchases. They've taken down some digital services taxes they had on us already. They're moving their tariffs down. This is going to be a really important deal, and it's going to reverberate for many years to come.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity, I'm sure. Corporate America, is worried about China, right? They understand, I think, at this point, thanks to President Trump spelling it out, that the CCP is an adversary, and they're looking for an off-ramp in terms of manufacturing. Now, I know you and your colleagues want that manufacturing here in the United States, but for those companies that are looking for an off-ramp, would India be an appropriate place to do supply chains if they want to perhaps take supply chains out of China?
It can be. We know that many companies already are going that direction. As you mentioned, we want the supply chains here in the United States and as close to home as possible. We know that it's a process when you're shifting from globalization and all of the challenges that's presented for our country. When you're shifting to a more resilient and secure economy, at some point you have to shift supply chains around. India can be a way station for that. They have a lot of folks there. They have manufacturing capacity. Of course, we want to make sure that American manufacturing is first and foremost. The American worker is first. But certainly, to the extent we're going to import from other countries, India can be a good source as long as it's balanced and it's fair.
And what is the status of the U.S.-China trade relationship at this point?
It's stable. We have regular conversations with our counterparts. We're identifying areas where we can and should trade. We're trying to make sure that trade is flowing in areas that are quite important to both of us, that we're getting rare earths that we need from China, that we're sending a lot of the ag products or aircraft or other things that we sell. So that's a stable relationship. Again, the president just spoke with President Xi last week, had a positive call. Secretary Besson and I, we speak with our counterpart with some frequency, and so does our staff. So I expect that we'll have some more discussions with them prior to the President Xi and President Trump's meeting in April.
Well, obviously there's not the kind of, hyperbole and upset over tariffs today than there was back in April of last year, as it seems that companies are better understanding the administration's priorities of national security. But what do you want to say to some of those manufacturers out there, like the auto sector, who, the automakers are worried that the tariffs are going to hit profits, obviously going to hit margins? What do you want to say about reducing the pressure there for those companies as you prioritize national security and use tariffs as leverage?
Well, it's important to understand our overall goals when it comes to trade policy, and it feeds into our broader economic objectives. We want to get the trade deficit down, we want to get manufacturing up, and we want real wages to go up. And so when we look at the last quarter, manufacturing productivity in the United States surged to 5% higher than expectations. Wages, real wages for manufacturing workers went up. So our workers are making more, and they're making more money. They're producing more goods. It's exactly what we're trying to do. Is there going to be some turbulence for companies occasionally because they're shifting supply chains? There probably will be, but we're focused on the workers, and they're making more money, and they're making more stuff, and that's what we want to see happen. And we're seeing the deficit go down, so we're hitting all of those goals right now.
And part of the reason the deficit went down is because you've been able to raise these hundreds of billions of dollars in tariff revenue, but that could change. If we get the Supreme Court decision. We're expecting it in the next week and a half or 2 weeks, around February 20th. I know you've said to me in the past that you believe that the Supreme Court will likely rule in the U.S.'s favor, but can you walk us through what the plan is to replace that tariff revenue should the Supreme Court go against the administration?
Well, I won't do it in too much detail. Again, we're confident in the case. I would just say that every country and every company and every worker we're protecting should understand that tariffs are going to be part of the trade policy landscape going forward. If the Supreme Court goes the wrong way, then we'll find ways we'll use other tools to address some of the unfair trade policies that these countries are pursuing that are generating these giant trade surpluses with us. So we'll do that. It might take a little more time, but we're focused on having continuity in the type and level of tariffs that would need to be imposed if the Supreme Court went the other way.
And of course, you've talked about a lot of deals this morning. You even mentioned Bangladesh. You did a deal with Argentina, India. What other countries are on the horizon or down the road that we should think about with regard to this new trade policy?
I would point to Indonesia as the next big one. This is a country of 250 million people, growing middle class, young country. It's going to have a lot of consumers. Complementary economy for us in that they can and they are buying a lot of U.S. goods and commodities. So this is something where we expect to finalize it within the next couple of weeks. We're having almost daily conversations with the Indonesians, and this is something that we're all excited about, to open this market to U.S. exports.
Yeah, another huge market opportunity there for the U.S. Jamieson, it's great to talk with you. Thanks so much for walking us through all of that. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great one.
And to you, Jamieson Greer at the White House. Stay with us. We'll be right back.